In the age of constant content creation, Insta stories and algorithms where artists are encouraged to simply keep making, keep releasing new stuff, to keep themselves in the conversation, we are flooded with something new to consume at every moment. And the result is so much noise that sometimes you almost feel like you can't hear anything at all. As they say, how do you drink from a fire hose? Is it possible, one wonders, to remain relevant, to stay in the circle, but just not play by those rules? Welcome to The Third Story. I'm Leo Sidran. When bassist and composer Todd Sickafoose released his last record, Tiny Resistors, it had a quiet impact on a generation of musicians and fans. Musically, it was flexible and open, but it was also structured and intentional. It featured a band of musicians who are all esteemed artists in their own right, including Allison Miller, Shane Ensley, Alan Ferber, Ani DiFranco, Andrew Bird, Mike Gamble, and former guests of this podcast, Adam Levy and Ben Wendell. And like so much great art, Tiny Resistors sounds as contemporary today as it did when it was made, which is no insignificant thing when you consider that it came out in 2008. Today, Todd Sickafoose lives in Eugene, Oregon, but he grew up in San Francisco and he lived in Brooklyn for a long time before making it back to the West Coast. 15 years after releasing Tiny Resistors, he's putting out the follow-up. It's called Bear Proof, 62 minutes of music written for 8 musicians, intended to be performed straight through in a concert. The record captures one continuous take. The band is made up mostly of musicians who, like Todd, have ties to the Bay Area. It's essentially a through-composed piece organized around the sonic palette of accordion, cornet, clarinet, violin, piano, bass, and drums. Not only has it been 15 years since Todd released an album of original music, but it's actually been nearly 10 years since this latest one was recorded. It was captured in 2014, so this one has been marinating for a while too. But Todd has stayed busy since then. He's been playing with Ani DiFranco for 2 decades now, as well as writing music for film and podcasts and producing records for others like singer-songwriters Venable and Anais Mitchell. It was his ongoing collaboration with Anais Mitchell that led to their work together on the hit Broadway musical Hadestown, which led Todd to win both a Grammy and a Tony for his production and orchestration work, respectively. Todd Sickafoose is a quiet force. He has a calm, sweet energy about him, and it's easy to see why he puts others at ease in the studio and on stage. Meanwhile, his music is bold and emotive, provocative, and soulful. I love it. We talked recently about all of it, about Hadestown and the process of putting together a Broadway musical, working with Ani DiFranco for 20 years, the new record Bear Proof, releasing music in today's world, why bass players make good record producers, and how a skin cancer diagnosis has impacted his life personally and professionally. Third-story.com is the place to go to sign up, subscribe, and check the archive. Hundreds of deep dives like this one, including the aforementioned conversations with Adam Levy and Ben Wendell, plus others with the likes of Ben Wendell's mom, for example, Dale Franzen, who is one of the producers of Hadestown, Andre DeShields, who is one of the stars of Hadestown. Let's see who else. Other notable Bay Area musical babies like Charlie Hunter, Stephen Bernstein, and David Garibaldi. So many. Bass-playing producers like Larry Klein, Michael League, Andres Levin. There are a lot of roads through the jungle of these conversations, and you can find yours at third-story.com. We are made in partnership with WBGO Studios. Visit wbgo.org/studios to find out more about all their award-winning content, and then it's patreon.com/thirdstorypodcast to keep the ghost light lit here. Here's me and Todd Sickafoose talking it down last month.
Hi.
Hey, man.
Hi.
Todd Sickafoose, I found an email that I wrote to you 10 years ago. It's the first time I reached out to you.
Yeah, if I remember right, you were looking for a bass.
I was trying to
You were
rent.
playing at Yoshi's in Oakland.
I was trying to rent a bass. That's exactly right. First time I called you was to rent a bass. Second time was for you to play the
Wait,
bass.
did I help you out?
No, you needed the bass for a gig at SF
I was
Jazz, a
using the
rehearsal.
bass. Okay, I got it.
The second time I called you was for you to play the bass.
Yeah.
And that didn't work out either. Then I tried to get an interview happening with you in, I think, 2020 at Winter Jazz Fest.
Winter Jazz, and the timing didn't work or something.
And so it's now a decade. It's actually a decade in the making, this encounter.
This sounds disappointingly like a lot of other conversations right now in my life. Things take a long time. There's a lot of things to do in life.
There's a lot of things to do in life. And man, imagine if we had done an interview, let's say 5 years ago or 8 years ago. I mean, the conversation would be so massively different, I think, particularly around your career. And I'm actually really glad that we waited until now, and that also we get to talk about your new record and, everything you've been up to.
Oh, good. As you can imagine. I mean, probably a lot of people would have the same feeling. I feel like I'm just doing the same things, but yeah, I see how that could be true. Yeah.
I think maybe the easiest way to approach this conversation is for us to work backwards, because actually the occasion of our meeting officially here today is that you, after, the numbers better than I do, 12 years, 13 years, are releasing a new record under your own name.
Uh-huh. Right. Yeah, I think something like that is true.
You're putting out Bear Proof, which is the sort of the answer to Tiny Resistors, I guess.
It was me trying to do something a little different than Tiny Resistors. I wanted to, after we recorded Tiny Resistors and that band became more of a thing that we would do with different people in different places. Yep. And the cohesive factor being that we all knew the music really well, and things could evolve and happen in nice ways. I wanted to swing the pendulum the other direction and make a piece of music that was very scripted from beginning to end, that could be a more repeatable experience. And that was Bear Proof. And in some ways, maybe part of why it kind of sat around for a little bit is I thought most of it as a live thing. It has been very satisfying to perform. It was interesting to record, and it was a unique experience to record. We actually recorded the whole 60-something minute piece in one take. The record is take 2, actually.
I heard a rumor that you were thinking about releasing the record as one track.
One track. Well, it would make sense like that, and especially these days where the audio platforms are so unreliable about track spacing. I think it's discouraged people from having a lot of segues on records because oftentimes they just don't play correctly. So, it's always a little bit of a gamble. I'm making a little bit of a bid for someone to actually sit and listen to the whole thing because of the way it's constructed and the way it's played.
Do you think it can be consumed either out of sequence or just kind of piecemeal, or that's really not the intention for it?
That's not really the intention. I got convinced to release a couple of singles before the entire album comes out. It's an odd idea with this, but I think the 2 pieces that we chose actually work like that, and maybe that just whets someone's appetite to actually sit and spend an hour with it. It really is consecutively played. You don't stop for an hour. There's no chance to say anything or adjust anything. Hit go and the rocket launches.
You recorded this in 2014.
That's right. Yeah, it was quite a while ago. There was more music that I recorded around that time too, a little before that, things that were even more in the vein of Tiny Resistors, with much of that same band in New York, kind of in the same way, and all of that stuff is sort of still sitting around too.
So why put it out now?
I went back and looked around and found it and dusted off the cobwebs in the beginning of the pandemic and realized I still stand by this as a composition. And there was just so much joy in everyone's playing. It felt like something I still stood by, but it also felt like I had a responsibility to the musicians. And a friend of mine here where I live told me one time, we were hanging out, and he said, "Oh yeah, you got to finish things, because the projects that you're going to do next, they can see how you're treating these ones." So he said, you got to treat them well and respect them so that the other ones, pop their heads out.
Yeah, right.
I thought that sounded smart.
You did 2 takes on the record. This is the second take. So in between the first take and second take, were you like, I mean, I know it's a long time ago, but specifically talking about a piece, the first piece, like, oh, don't forget, if we're going to do it again, or you're not able to talk about that level of specificity.
Well, honestly, we did the first take at the end of the first day, and then we went home and slept and dreamt about it, and then we came back and did the second one. It's always that second morning. Everybody's fresh, but you don't have to think about technical things. That's right. A beautiful moment in a recording session. But yeah, honestly, we had gotten pretty good at the music at that point. We'd been playing it a lot. We played it live on the radio once. We had rehearsed a bunch, quite a bit, a generous amount of rehearsal, which these days just feels like heaven, especially for something like this that's got a lot of detail to it. But it was more about the choreography. How are you going to not drop something that ends up in 17 microphones? That was more what we talked about in between takes.
And I think you said there's one overdub or something where Jenny dropped her bow or something and you had to do one little fix.
So, yeah, maybe that's why that's on my mind. Yeah, I think that's really true.
So many bass players become great producers and great music directors, overseers of projects. Do you think there's something about seeing the music from the vantage point of the bass that is particularly helpful when it comes to having a more global vision of a project?
Yeah, that is a real phenomenon, isn't it? I do think those two things have to go hand in hand, and it probably is a chicken or an egg thing. I think the people who are drawn to that instrument probably already have those tendencies, and then and then the other way around, once you're at that instrument, you're just sitting, like you say, in a place where you can hear and see things in a particular way, and maybe it's an instrument that affords you a little bit more time in between the notes, and maybe there's a kind of bandwidth issue to it where you're welcome to experience what's happening in front of you in a different way.
I like that there's space in between the notes, because it's true, right? I mean, I think the frustration of guitar players when they're asked to play bass is that they get bored. They want to do more than the bass is asking of them. You just have to.
Yeah, but music is not about doing a lot. It's about doing the right thing, isn't it?
But in the same way that I think like trombone players and violists are often good arrangers, and I think maybe because they're in the middle of the range, that they kind of hear things from right in the center. I think bass players maybe make good producers in the same way that they have to be both responsible as a rhythm section instruments, and also, unlike drummers, they also have to be responsible for some melodic and harmonic stuff too.
You're also so aware of acoustics and how it changes the nature of how your instrument works with the rest of the band, and how the whole thing is functioning as a whole. Your instrument is so at the mercy of the sound waves in whatever space you're performing in, and you oftentimes need to adjust how you're playing to that, and that can translate into a sense of how to make things work in the recording studio.
Yeah. But of course, producing records is only partly technical. It's part of it is musical. And then there's also a very personal aspect to producing records, when you're helping somebody else to execute their project.
Yeah. And the balance of knowing when to offer your own vision, your own sensibility and instincts, and when to let it be.
Did you find that was a kind of a natural fit for you?
I think so. Yeah, you're sort of making it up from scratch every moment you're doing it, I think, in a way, or at least that's been my experience. You get experience making records that is applicable going forward in some ways, but even if you tried, you can't repeat the experience of making a record with all the same elements. It just doesn't work that way. So you're constantly having to learn a new situation just as you go on your feet, I think.
I think you're right. I mean, it's funny. The question that pops in my head when you say that is, well, how do you know when you're doing it? How do you know when you're producing a record? Other than somebody says, well, you're producing it. As you say, sometimes the right thing to do might be to not say anything, that this is not the moment for me to interject my aesthetic on this.
Mm-hmm. There's a lot that has to happen in the moment, but it's not to be overlooked the things that you can think about in advance. I care a lot about the experience of a recording project for the musicians involved, and even just the sheer enjoyment factor. And so much of that can really be affected by
Hmm.
having a real clear vision in advance about what to start with and what to end with. That thing of what's the last thing that you do on a record,
Yeah.
it means a lot. And
Huh.
that can be an oversight. You can end a record with something that doesn't work, an idea that ends in a dead end.
And then everybody's sort of left with a kind of feeling of,
Well, it's just not as satisfying as sticking the landing.
hmm.
And so I don't know. I care about that. So those things add up. Yeah, it's a moving target, and it's a little bit just out of our control, which is probably adds to the fascination and the obsession that we all feel in trying to cozy up to that music.
It seems like one of the major distractions or interruptions in your life and in your ability to release solo records was Hadestown, which I imagine occupied an enormous amount of your last decade.
It did. It was all encompassing when it was happening, and I wore a lot of hats in that process, and those hats stayed on my head until pretty recently. It was surprising even to me. That's not true anymore right now, and it feels a little liberating. And yeah, we continue to all be so proud of the way that it gets honored night after night.
Well, let's talk about some of the hats. You ultimately end up winning a Tony for orchestration and producing the cast recording. Before that, you had worked on the original record with Anais Mitchell that turned into the musical. I mean, your journey with this project seems like it goes all the way back to the inception of the project.
That's right. Yeah, 2006, I think, was when I started working on it. And she and Michael Chorney, who I shared the orchestration wing with, were working on it for about a year before that. In 2006, I came on board to ostensibly produce what was going to be a studio version of it. And we made that. And in the wake of that, it sort of became, before that, it was a theater production. It was on stage. It was very DIY. I was a part of that. I made a point of trying to be a part of that as much as I could, so I could learn as much as possible about everything about what Anais was doing, what everybody was doing, how to shape the music for the recording. And that was up in the Northeast in the winter, and we traveled by school bus. I mean, it was a really funny thing to imagine for anybody who knows it just as its Broadway incarnation.
Stagecoach kind of vibe, right? Like really old school.
It was one night in each place, and the chorus, if you can call it that, were also the crew, and they were moving lights around on the stage, and I mean the whole thing. We just all couldn't get enough of it. Sometimes people ask me, could you foresee what happened? Well, in one way, no, but in another way, we all just felt very strongly about what Anais had started, and we all would do anything for her. So there was that always, and maybe that is really powerful. Maybe that's a thing that lasts.
An idea that is compelling enough that it would put all that talent on a school bus and inspire them to get involved and then hold on for as long as they held on. Maybe it does speak to the idea that some ideas are just stickier than others or more compelling.
Exactly. And also that's a rare thing. You don't encounter too many of those in life. So it's good to pay attention and give all you got to the ones that do.
So you got called in to produce the record, and before you produced it, you said, okay, well, let me get involved here and see what's going on. You performed it. You sort of got inside the material, and you end up making this record that in itself was a pretty interesting project. It had all these kind of guest singers, and it was a complete and beautiful presentation of the project. So then what happened after that record came out?
It became mostly something that we conceived of as a music project for a long time. The format of the performances was something like Anais and the band would roll into an area of the country, the Northwest, and connect with some notable and beautiful singer-songwriters or singers of whatever ilk in that area, and rope them into different roles and learn the music, and then do a handful of performances around that region. That was something that lasted, I think, 2 or 3 or 4 years, and really satisfying, and took part in some of those and Michael Chorney led the band for those. That was a fun period. And then that sort of wrapped up. And pretty soon after that, the producer that ended up being the lead producer still for the show approached Anais and said, have you ever thought about putting this back on the stage?
Who was the lead producer, by the way?
Her name is Mara Isaacs.
Yeah.
She's great. And I think that the way that she went about handling the whole project, we all owe her a lot.
Was there anybody other than Mara involved in the project that knew anything about how a show might end up on Broadway? Like, was there anybody who had any familiarity with what that journey looks like?
Probably not. Yeah. It has always felt to me like we just snuck in through the back door.
Yeah.
And of course we worked on it, and there were revisions and pretty major changes right up until when we actually opened on Broadway, even in the previews on Broadway.
Yeah.
But the language of the show and the philosophy of it being poetry, not prose, and the sort of core integrity of the music was intact so long before anybody put their hand up and said, can we help you put this back on stage again? It had a sort of protective bubble around it. And no one ever tried to pierce that. No one ever asked us to consider doing something for some kind of weird commercial reason. People knew better than that.
I hear from my friends who work on shows that, as you say, up until the last minute, things can change. You can be adding songs, changing arrangements, whatever, that it's constantly in flux until it gets fixed. But in the case of Hadestown, you have this added time capsule in that you have the original record, and then you have the cast recording. And although we may not know exactly how you got from point A to point B, there are some songs that are the same, and the arrangements are so different, and the orchestrations are so different. It's almost like in an archaeological way or an anthropological way, we get a chance to sort of figure out, well, it started here and it ended here, and we have to sort of fill in the blanks.
All aboard! Follow that dollar for a long way down, far away from the poorhouse door. Either get to hell or to Hadestown. Ain't no difference anymore. Way down, Hadestown, way down under the ground. Follow that dollar for a long way down, far away from the poorhouse door. You either get to hell or to Hadestown. Ain't no difference anymore. Way down, Hadestown, way down under the ground.
Yeah, and it's fun to talk about the musical journey of all that, the poetry journey of all that. Anais wrote a book called Working on a Song, where she fleshes out exactly what you're talking about and connects the dots. And it's very interesting. And I think anybody who's a little bit interested in that ought to read that, because it's fascinating, even to me who've lived through all that.
And in terms of the musical aspect of it, I mean, what was it? It seems like one piece of it is, to not be at all attached to what you had done before. Like when you get into the process of taking it to the stage, you have to just be prepared to
blow everything up,
explode it and start over.
True. And there was a lot of that. And you're just involved all the time, because there isn't a moment in the show that isn't a bar of music. So every change is all encompassing and adjusting the score. When we were in previews, we had this system where I would make changes after, the show would end, and then we'd talk for 2 hours. And, it was a lively, really creative bunch of people with really smart and beautiful ideas coming from all corners of the creative team. That would wrap up, and then everybody else would go home, and I would go and monkey around with the score. I found this back room in a hotel in Midtown where there were plugs and stools, but no one was ever there at 1 a.m. I would go there every night. And then when I would finish, I would send everything to the beloved copyist that we had a relationship when we were at the National Theatre, who was in London, and the timing worked out really well because he was already up. And then everything would be ready for the music stands first thing in the morning. It was an intense process of navigating that process of getting to the finish line. And even at this point, it feels like, so many things landed at the right place how did that happen? How did the timing of that work? It's that thing that you sometimes experience where you have 2 hours and 10 minutes to get ready to leave on a trip, and somehow it takes 2 hours and 9 minutes, and you just think, how did that happen? But maybe that's just what life is. You adjust to the circumstances, and for Anais, that meant letting go of some things. It was quite meta for her. Her job when the show opened and we locked everything and she couldn't make any more changes was to do exactly what Orpheus's job was, just walk out the front door and don't look back. Her work was done.
I suppose that's the thing that songwriters in general have to deal with, composers on any level, in this more theoretical sense, which is that you put work out in the world and it sort of doesn't belong to you at a certain point. I mean, even if it's the complete fruit of all your labor, even if it was born out of your heart and your soul and your work, once it's out in the world, the way it is consumed, what it means to other people, it's not about you anymore. But what you're describing, particularly for her, and I think that's what's so kind of deep about Broadway to me, is that the shows get locked at a certain point. They're dynamic, they're changing, they're constantly changing. You're up all night changing it until one day you're not, and then you can't anymore. Then it's unchangeable.
That's right.
For example, if with Bear Proof, with your through composed project, which is intentionally composed, if from today till tomorrow you decided, you know what, I do want to change something about this for the next time we perform it, you could, but not with Hadestown. It's locked.
Yeah. I know. It's this weird, it's almost got us, in a sense, both sides. There's this live element that's, the thing itself is being recreated from scratch in front of an audience every single night.
That's right.
That is live performance. That is freshness. I mean, the actors are bringing incredibly spontaneous, detailed things to life every time they, quote unquote, raise the curtain. But it is also like a recorded medium in the sense that it's scripted from beginning to end.
It seems like part of the reason they freeze it the way they do is in order to protect the intellectual property, right? Like it's a thing where it's like, this is now, we're going to sell this and we're going to license it and we're going to, and it has to be recreated. It has to be something that can be taught to another generation of people who are, I mean, ever since the show opened on Broadway, a lot of members have changed. People in the band have changed. People on the leads have changed. Like there have been a lot of things that have changed. But so it has to be locked enough that it can be passed from one person to another. People in the theater will always say, well, that's the magic of live performance, right? Is that it's fresh every day. But hearing you say that raises a question for me. What was it like for you to live in a project that basically became a kind of repetitive cycle, especially once you got into that final, you come from a world both of improvised music and also of music that is very alive, to make a project that ultimately has to stay fixed. I mean, what was that like for you to live in that world?
I didn't experience it that way. I mean, I think, as musicians, we're involved in music that's all over the spectrum of how much of it needs to be rediscovered every time, and so there's that zoomed out thing of what percentage of this is going to come together right in front of us all together. But whatever that percentage is, you're working just as hard on it. And you know what I mean? And so I don't know. I'm not sure if where something is on that spectrum is the most important thing, or the thing that I would experience more than other elements.
I've wondered sometimes what it's like to be. I'll give you an example. I saw Elvis Costello play at the Beacon last month, and when it came time for him to sing Watching the Detectives and Allison and some of his other big songs, I could feel him wrestling with the over-familiarity of those songs. Like he agreed with his audience that he would sing them. I'm going to sing these tunes for you. I know you want to hear them. But he kind of refused to do it the way you expected him to do it, and I understood that, because I think after a certain amount of time with the material, it becomes exhausting to have to step into that exact same outfit every night, and I could feel him sort of saying, okay, well, I can't be that guy anymore. I've got to be this person, and the music is going to change over time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I stand 8 feet to the left of Ani DiFranco to play Little Plastic Castle 1,000 times in my life, and luckily, she's of the mindset that she wants it to be different every time, and she'll admit that. She's the first to admit that. I understand that instinct, and ultimately that's probably better for the audience anyway. They're getting a more honest thing. And why do you want to hear something that's the same? You want to hear that spark of freshness, or like you say, someone sort of poking out at the edges, or wrestling with their own costume that they've got on.
that they've grown out of. I'm glad you brought up the relationship with Ani DiFranco, and I wonder where that, just where that fits into your life. You're almost 20 years on now playing with Ani.
Yeah. And I have to say that Ani is the reason why I met Anais originally. And of course, she was responsible for setting us off on that project at the very beginning. The original Hadestown record came out on her label. She sang one of the prominent roles on it. But yeah, it's been a constant in my life. I think it's 19 years at this point. Every time I sit back and examine it a little bit, it feels like as a kid, I had this experience all the time of, it's hard to pick your campsite at the end of a backpacking trip because you always want to see what's around the next bend. I think I'm like that with music a little bit. I just want to know what's going to happen next. And I feel that way strongly about the relationship with her because it's always been interesting. Every phase has been interesting.
You met her or started working with her after you opened for her? I read that. Maybe that's not true too, but is that the case?
No, it is. Yeah, there's an artist called Venable who's really interesting and great. We opened for her twice and met her during that time. The first time, Ani had a big, huge 6-piece band, really powerful band. And then in between those two times, she had sort of disbanded that and gone back to her roots of just playing by herself. And so the second time she was out there by herself, she was thinking about putting together a different band for a recording with Joe Henry. And all of Joe Henry's normal wrecking crew was roped in, Jay Bellarose, Patrick Warren, people like that. But there was no bass player. And she said, well, there's this guy who I'm digging every night here. And
the name of that album was Knuckle Down.
My cowgirl alter ego riding on her barroom bull, dripping with the sweat of irony as the cowboys whoop and drool, shooting glances at the mirror to see if her scar is showing. She is truly going nowhere tonight. Lecherous old lady wanna be much too young and shy, flailing her whole life just thinking she could teach herself to fly. Vehement, romantic, frantic, for forever right now, but forever's going nowhere tonight.
So that was the first thing that she asked me to do, but then we started playing together and working on those songs, and it just became something that felt really good. And for a year at the very beginning, I think we just played duo, and the music that she was writing around that time seemed especially suited to that. So it was working like that.
Do you think working with Ani, especially in helping to sort of birth those songs with her, prepared you in some way for the Hadestown experience?
Yeah, maybe so. There's a kind of discipline in a theater project because there's so many moving parts and you have to wait for the right turn to sort of advocate for something. And it's just a big, huge machine that requires so much maintenance and formality in a way. Even when you're having informal ideas or raw ideas that are about emotion, they have to be filtered and codified almost immediately sometimes. And that part of the process is very different than a lot of other things in my musical life. But I've always been a pretty detailed oriented person, so it suits me. I felt right at home in that.
How did you define the musical palette of the stage show of Hadestown? I mean, when you make a record, you can kind of, you can put one instrument on one track and not on another if you want to. You can sort of blow open the walls if you need to. Hadestown original record, it kind of has a defined sound, but when you went to take it to the stage, the trombone comes forward, the cello comes forward. Right. You have all these sounds that you sort of chose as somehow representative elements in the music.
Yeah, well, the instrumentation becomes everything.
Yeah.
You've got 7 acoustic instruments. I mean, it's beautiful. The power could go off in the Walter Kerr Theater and we could keep going because these instruments are just, their sound is coming straight off the stage. But what can you do with these 7 acoustic instruments? You've got 2 hours to answer that question in as many ways as you possibly can.
The first thing to do was to say, we want these to be entirely acoustic instruments, and these are going to be the 7 instruments that we're going to use.
Well, in some ways that was baked in, because that's how it happened at the very beginning.
Yeah.
And we made some adjustments. Some of these things are, if you answered honestly, it would be about who was around in Vermont at the time that Anais and Michael started working in 2005 on the songs. And some of the instrumentation we tried to lift up so that it was a little bit brighter. You're honoring Hades, but you don't want it to get too subterranean in its sound. You need some balance and some lightness. And so we did everything we could to raise that up into the air a little bit. But a lot about the instrumentation was baked in. We added the pianist doubling on accordion at the New York Theater Workshop off Broadway, and that stuck and remains to this day. But that was the 7th piece.
So when you entered the project, there were already 6 pieces. Those sounds were there.
That's right.
You talk about this, you want to honor Hades, but you want to try to find some lightness when you can. I mean, it gives me a sense that in order to approach the orchestration of a project like this, you have to have a kind of an overarching understanding of what you're trying to achieve, what intellectually is happening, what in a literary function is happening, or a dramaturgical way is happening, and also what's going to sound good. Like those are kind of interacting with each other.
Especially with continuous music. Yes. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of pacing to think about, zoomed in emotions and zoomed out emotions and the arc of these different things. And when something is too on the nose and when you feel like actually you do need to mark a moment more. I just said a sort of run-on sentence that was probably a lot more analytical than a lot of our conversations, which stayed in the realm more of your question, stayed in the realm of emotions.
When you won the Tony, when it was your turn to speak, you said something like you were appreciative of the openness, that there was an openness in the space.
When you sneak in through the back door like we did, you don't expect to be welcomed like this, so thank you. And may this community only become more and more welcoming.
You had come from the outside. You didn't come from the sort of the Broadway world. You came from another planet, really, and here you were being kind of rewarded by the Broadway community for this work.
Partly, it's just that we came from a more purely music space. But yeah, I think Broadway music is talked about as a style, which is just insanity. And as much as that can be cracked open and infiltrated by different music, the more the better.
Did you feel along the way that there was any antagonism or that you were treated as outsiders on the path to Broadway? Were you feeling like maybe...
By who?
I don't know, by anybody in the establishment, or I mean, or even just in terms of the process, feeling like, wow, we really stepped in from the outside here.
No, and that's not to be taken for granted. There's a lot of camaraderie in that community. It's a pretty small artistic community, and everybody works really hard.
Yeah,
really hard. So there's a lot of support.
Was it stressful?
Sure. Yeah, at times. Yeah, but mostly art stressful. We wanted to get it right, and be the right part of the team. Support the other people who are in these different parts of the show.
When you hear it now, are you able to listen to it just as a finished piece of music? Do you hear your decisions, or do you hear it as music?
I think anything that you work on really hard, you always hear what's behind it, and you hear details in it that probably escape other people. But yeah, it's been some years now since we were under the hood like that, so there is a freshness. It's always nice to go back to music that you know really well, and hear it in different ways.
We're here talking about a show that you worked on and orchestrated that opened years ago and is still part of your life and your narrative. We're here talking about Bear Proof, which is a record that apparently you recorded almost a decade ago and are just prepared to talk about now. On the one hand, I'm kind of inspired by the thinking that the work that we make, if it's done right, is outside of time, at least the work that you're making, and that it doesn't really matter. I mean, this is kind of incredible, Todd, that we're here talking about 2 major projects that are not happening right now. These are things that have been made and that we're talking about. So what did you do after the Hadestown experience was over? What have the last few years been like for you?
I mean, I continue to help other people make lots of records.
Yeah.
That takes a lot of my artistic time. And of course, we've hit on some of the other things. I've spent a lot of time out with Ani performing and other groups, in particular projects with Jenny Scheinman and Allison Miller. I've dealt with some health problems in the last bunch of years, and it takes a lot of time to heal. And I've spent a lot of time in that zone and a lot of energy on that. My family is a real source of love and balance from that. You're a father. You know how it is.
A father and a son. In one of our first email exchanges, when you learned that I was playing music with my own father, you said to me, "Oh, that's interesting. My parents were not musical, but my kids are musical. I wonder if one day I'll play music with them."
Oh, that's great to hear so many years later and see that starting to come true a little bit. Yeah.
How old are your kids?
They're 9 and 11, 2 girls.
And do they play music?
Yeah, they're starting to a little bit. We had a little bit of a different year last year. My wife is a college professor. She's on faculty at University of Oregon.
Yeah.
In the education college. And last year was her first sabbatical, and she arranged to do some research in Mexico, and we lived in Oaxaca for the whole year. In fact, I think we left to go down there a year ago today.
Wow.
It was a wild experience, and I think probably from this point on, I'll write music in 3 for the rest of my life. It made me want to learn the tuba.
Did you take a bass with you?
I didn't really have an instrument down there. I was coming back up here to play, but I took my ears with me, and that was incredible.
I think the most prolific songwriting year of my life was my junior year in college when I studied abroad in Spain and had no instrument. Eventually, I went out and bought a cheap guitar, and as soon as I got my hands on the guitar, it was just like a flood of songs. And I think it was like because I hadn't had an instrument for a while, you know?
Yeah. Input mode.
Yeah, input mode, exactly.
I like that.
So you were flying back up here to play gigs, and then you'd go back down to Mexico and live. And
it was a little crazy, but
yeah,
it was worth it.
And what is it like to be in Eugene? I mean, for you, how has that transition been? What was it like to move to Eugene?
I moved here in a kind of lucky way because it was almost 10 years ago, and I'm still going out and working with a lot of the same people. I mean, it's been a wonderful way to support my wife, to be able to be here and still do what I do. It's not the most ideal place a lot of times, and it requires a little bit of a split screen life. Oftentimes when I'm playing music, I can't just go home afterwards. I'm somewhere else, but it's worth it. And Eugene's got a lot of lovely qualities that have only grown on us. I bet it has a lot in common with Madison. Hadn't really ever thought of that.
Yeah, I think there's something to that. That split screen life is an interesting way of describing it, right? Because you're never fully integrating the two things. Like, yeah, I hear what you're saying. When you're on the road, you know, you're playing, but you're like basically totally musician. You don't get to be dad in the same day, and you don't get to sort of be your full self. And then when you're home, there's this aspect of you that is untapped that you're not able to do. And is there a music scene there that you have plugged into, or in Portland, or do you do any local stuff?
A little bit. I've got friends and colleagues up in Portland, and there's a little bit here. And of course, I've got my basement studio pretty dialed in where I do a lot of work. But this is an audio format, so you're the only one who can see that right now behind me. I
can see the beautiful panels in the ceiling and on the walls. It looks like you totally tightened up the room and it's all dialed in.
Hopefully you can tell with my recorded voice here.
Yeah.
Eugene is a lovely place, though. I don't regret coming here.
But so much of your musical identity was actually formed in the Bay Area. You came out of a place and a generation of musicians who all seem to have found their way together, and now I guess separately also. But I'm curious how you feel that just having come from the Bay Area has marked your identity musically.
I don't know. There's something in the water there, isn't there? I can see it in other people better than myself, but there's a kind of Westernness, and it probably comes across on this record. You know, there are some people who don't technically live on the West Coast in this 8-piece band, but they're connected. They've got tentacles there. Allison Miller in particular, she's from Baltimore area and lives in New York, but she's sort of an honorary Bay Area musician at this point, and she is the artistic director of a great Santa Cruz Mountains jazz camp now.
Yeah, I guess because of that, I assumed that she had roots out there.
It's good enough.
She does now, yeah.
And Kirk is from Denver. That's Western enough.
Yeah.
I always think of people from Denver, especially. They're just the same. They got to the mountains and they said, "This is good enough. We don't need to go the whole way."
So I didn't know that you've been struggling with health stuff, and we don't have to get into it. But when you said that, one thought I had was just the complexity of being alive. You are given this enormous success, this wonderful gift. The Broadway thing put your name in front of all these people there you work, winning Tony, and there's a Grammy, and it's like you put all this work in and you were rewarded, and at the same time, you're dealing with health stuff. The good and the bad come equally sometimes.
I know I don't often talk about it except with friends and family, but you've put me at ease here. And it was a melanoma diagnosis that I got in 2017, so I was right smack in the middle of it, and all of that work towards Broadway, like you say. But I've been in remission most of those years, and then had a recurrence this spring, and hopefully, I think my prognosis is pretty good. But we're all in this situation where you don't know what's going to happen next, and maybe for me, it's a little bit that's a little bit brought to the surface. Check your moles. That's the moral of the story.
Did it reshape the way you thought about the kinds of projects you wanted to do, the things that you wanted to spend your time on?
Maybe so, but I think I had already been thinking about that, and I had already gotten to the place where there was more opportunity to do different things than I could possibly pull off as a singular person.
Yeah.
But yeah, more acutely felt for sure.
We know our time is limited, but we know it more, if you get a diagnosis.
That's right. And that's why I think a lot of people, especially if you're lucky enough to heal, wouldn't trade it, wouldn't say that they would rather not have the experience, because you learn something that's very useful about what it is to be waking up every morning. Even if the lesson is you're exactly in the right place. You've got the people around you that are matching your heart and what you need and what you want and what you can accomplish with this time.
Todd, it's such a pleasure to talk to you, man. And I know that we barely scratched the surface of so much of your career. We really just talked a little bit about Bear Proof and a little bit about Hadestown and a little bit about Ani DiFranco. But I'm really moved talking to you. You have a kind of a quiet reassurance about you that is really fun to be around.
Oh, thanks. I've really enjoyed this conversation too. Thank you, Leo.
There he was, my friends, the well-tempered Todd Sickafoose. What a sweet guy. What you hear behind me is Reverse Fortune, the closing track, if it's fair to call it a track, from Bear Proof. I'll be back in your headspace with another deep dive before you know it. Until then, I'll talk to you soon.
This has been a WBGO Studios production. To learn more about WBGO Studios' award-winning podcasts, special concerts, live streams, and more, visit wbgo.org/studios.